Thanks, Tim. It's a pleasure to be back. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It was about third quarter of 2020 when I last presented to Share Cafe. So I really wanted to use the next 10 minutes or so as a little bit of an opportunity to update on CASIA. As you've heard, it's been a really big year for our company and a big fourth quarter. So I wanted to just recap some of the important things that have been happening in the last 3 or 4 months. Just first of all, a brief reminder of CASIA and a brief introduction for those who are unfamiliar with the story. We are an oncology biotech company. That means we do nothing but the development of drugs for cancer. And cancer is about half of the global market for new medicines these days. So this is very much the most important part of the commercial opportunity. We're a late stage company. That means our drugs are in human trials, and specifically our lead drug is in a pivotal study, which is the final stage of trials before commercialization. So we're very late in the game as a company. Our lead drug is called Paxlovid, and it's being developed for brain cancer, and particularly for a form of brain cancer known as glioblastoma, which is the most common and aggressive form. We also have a drug called Cantrixil, which is being developed for ovarian cancer. I'm not going to talk about that today because it's a little bit earlier stage. So next slide, please. This slide is just a real high-level summary of some of the key points around Paxlovid, and I won't go through it in detail, but I think the first thing to say is that this is a very, very good quality drug. It was originally developed by a company called Genentech. They are the most successful developer of cancer drugs in history. They decided they weren't going to be strategically focused on brain cancer, and so they partnered this drug out, and we were able to bring it into our company. We have a very, very clear path ahead to develop this drug. It is currently in a pivotal study. That is the last stage of the research and development of a new medicine. And that lines this up to potentially be launched into about a $1.5 billion a year commercial market. And as a company, we run very lean. We're an extremely efficient business, but we have a very, very highly credentialed board, management team, scientific advisory board to drive this forward. Next slide, please. So there's 5 key things I want to talk about from the last 3-4 months, and they're listed here. First of all, back in September of 2020, we announced a new clinical study, and this is part of a program of expansion around Paxlovid, which I'll talk about in more detail in a moment. This study was in a form of brain cancer called primary CNS lymphoma. And this is really interesting because lymphoma outside of the brain is a disease where drugs like ours have shown huge potential. So we're really excited now to be looking at the brain cancer version of this disease, if you like. And this, as I say, expands the opportunity for our drug. It gives us more shots on goal, and it gives us access to a broader commercial opportunity if we're successful. In October, we raised money. We did this all on the ASX. As you've heard, we do have securities on NASDAQ, but we did our financing all on the ASX. We raised $25 million, the bulk of that from sector specialist institutional investors. And that's really important because that sets us up so that we have a very good funding base in the bank as we move into our pivotal study. And so really almost a transformational financing round for our company. In November, we saw positive data from an ongoing study of our lead program, Paxlovid, in glioblastoma. I'll talk more about that in a moment. And then in December, we started a new study in childhood brain cancer in a disease called DIPG. This isn't a super common cancer, thankfully, because it really is one of the most horrific diseases in the brain cancer field, but it's an area where we've been really excited to see some encouraging data, and so we're thrilled to be moving forward. It's the very definition of a high unmet medical need. And then in January, we opened the first site to Paxlovid in our pivotal study, GBM Agile, and that really makes us quote unquote a phase 3 company, very much at the final chapter of the drug development process. Next slide, please. Now, this is a summary of the data we've been seeing with Paxlovid. We're comparing our drug Paxlovid here, the blue bars, against the existing FDA-approved standard of care, which is a drug called temozolomide. That's in the gray bars. And you can see here two measures of the effect of the drug. One, progression-free survival, measures the ability of the drug to delay recurrence of a tumor. The right-hand side shows overall survival, which is a measure of the ability of the drug to extend life. And focusing on the right-hand side of the slide, because that's really where the action is, we see with Paxlovid an overall survival of 17.5 months. For temozolomide, the existing FDA-approved standard of care, that figure is 12.7 months. Now, this isn't a perfect comparison because we're comparing data from our study versus data from a pre-existing study of temozolomide. But the magnitude of difference here really gives us a lot of confidence that, to put it simply, Paxlovid works. And on that basis, we've moved into a pivotal study for registration. Next slide, please. Now, I did mention that glioblastoma is not our only shot on goal. It's our primary focus because we think it's the quickest and least risky and smoothest path to market. But we do also have a very, very broad clinical trial program, as you see here, with activity in DIPG and primary CNS lymphoma. These are two other forms of brain cancer. Also 3 studies in brain metastases, that is cancer that has spread to the brain from elsewhere in the body, breast cancer, lung cancer, melanoma, for example. So this is an incredibly broad program, really, particularly for a company of our size. Each one of these represents a largely independent opportunity to commercialize Paxlovid. And if several of them pay out together, it really starts to build a very, very substantial commercial opportunity for our drug. Next slide, please. This is a quick snapshot of the GBM Agile pivotal study. This is a study that's already up and running at 35 sites in the US and Canada, shortly to open in Europe and later this year in China. And we opened the first site here, in fact, Henry Ford Cancer Institute in Detroit, Michigan, in fact, just before New Year, and they recruited their first patient with the Paxlovid arm active at the very beginning of January. This really is a watershed moment for our company. As I say, it marks our transition into the late part of clinical development. And should this study be successful, our expectation is that this will be used as a basis for an FDA approval. That's the point where we can start making revenue out of Paxlovid. Next slide, please. And some of these milestones have really been reflected in the valuation of the company. A shareholder at the 1st of July last year would have more than doubled their money by the beginning of January. And in fact, we're up already about 10–12% so far in 2021. And I think what this illustrates is that as this data starts to roll out, as we tick off milestones in the very rapid progression of this drug, that value is recognized by the market and recognized both here in Australia and also in the US via our NASDAQ listing. Next slide, please. So finally, just a word on the year ahead. We've really got 4 things we're aiming to do this year. Faultless execution of the GBM Agile study clearly is an absolute priority for us and something we'll be updating people on regularly. Really trying to drive more data out of this very broad clinical trial program will just build the value proposition of Paxlovid. Starting to talk to companies about partnering opportunities is a key goal for this year. Most companies like ours don't end up selling the drug themselves. They partner out to a larger company. That can happen at any time in the development cycle, and it's certainly an opportunity that becomes very live for us this year. And then finally, starting the process of building up towards an FDA registration. Next slide, please. And this is the last slide, just a snapshot of some of our key milestones. I'd say a health warning that I always put on our milestones: clinical research is unpredictable, especially in the time of a pandemic. So all of these can move around a little bit in the detail, and we have gone this year to reporting our milestones on a half-yearly basis until they become quite concrete, which you see reflected here. But regardless of exactly when data comes out, or exactly when milestones are achieved, each of these represents an opportunity to build the value of Paxlovid and thereby to build the value of Kazia. And this represents really a very, very positive year ahead for our company. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. And I'd be very happy to take some questions.
Thanks, James. we both mentioned the ADR listing, and the ADR listing seems to be driving the share price here. It's obviously attracting a lot of interest and big volume. Is there any insight into who's actually being active in terms of buying those ADRs?
Tim, as far as we can see, it's very broad based. I think we've definitely got on the radar of a lot of retail investors in the US. There's a lot of investors in that end of the market who are very active in the biotech sector. It's a much bigger sector in the US. There's perhaps quite a lot more activity there. But we are also seeing some institutional investors move in and out of the stock in the US. So I think that's been really encouraging too. So there's really not one single point that's driving this. I think it's really right across the spectrum, from some large funds down to some small day traders, and I think it's welcome. I think it just reflects the fact that we've arrived to a certain extent as a company, and as you say, it's been driving quite a lot of momentum in the share price.
And you showed a slide there where we're talking about glioblastoma, a particular type of brain cancer, and the application of your drug, and then you showed other potential diseases. Does FDA approval cover that range of diseases?
We need to show data for each disease that we're looking to approve the drug in. So we don't get them all in one go, but having got the drug approved in one disease, the subsequent approvals become much easier. So what we often see with cancer drugs is they'll get approval initially for a particular patient group, and sometimes that's quite restrictive. It can sometimes be quite a focused group of patients. But then over the lifetime of the product, that builds out with subsequent approvals that extend the life of the drug. And that can be as frequently as almost every 6 months or so. And we see the likely trajectory for Paxlovid looking very similar. I think the most likely outcome here is an approval in glioblastoma, but then that would rapidly be followed by other approvals in other forms of brain cancer, and indeed potentially in other forms of cancer outside the brain. So there'd be a lot to keep us busy even after the drug is approved. It's certainly not an all or nothing event. It's a constant process of refinement and improvement, even once the drug becomes a commercial product.
And there is obviously there's always a question around FDA approval. What's the time frame for that?
So best case for us looks to be about 2023 at this stage, and perhaps a more conservative case would take us out to the following year. Having said that, there is plenty of room for surprise, and that can come from a couple of places. So first of all, the GBM Agile study, our pivotal study, is an adaptive study. It can produce data at any time and potentially give us almost a fast track opportunity to FDA. We also have some of this work going on in other diseases that, were it to show a positive result, could move one of these other forms of brain cancer into pole position. We could, for example, end up going to FDA first of all with childhood brain cancer, and that could happen sooner than glioblastoma. So there's a few ways in which this could happen much sooner, but as a sort of cautiously optimistic case, I think we'd say 2023. I'd also say that's not the only way that we generate revenue from this asset. So it doesn't mean that we can't make any value out of Paxlovid until then. What companies like ours often do is they partner these drugs to larger companies, as I touched on. That's a transaction that could happen anytime. That could happen next week, next month, next year, and so on. And so we have a growing opportunity to monetize Paxlovid even before we achieve an FDA approval.